Thanks for tuning in to Green Energy. This is your host, Chris. Today we have our solar expert, Elle, with us. She's been working in the solar industry for over 15 years and has seen firsthand the changes that have been made. Thanks so much for coming in, Elle.
Yeah, you betcha. Thanks for having me.
So today, Elle is going to be talking about the industry as a whole, as she's the expert. So I'll turn it over to her. Would you mind just starting off with a brief overview for our listeners?
Sure thing, Chris. Solar power is energy from the sun that is converted into thermal or electrical energy. Solar energy is the cleanest and most abundant renewable energy source available. And the U.S. has some of the richest solar resources in the world. Solar technologies can harness solar energy in three main ways. Photovoltaics, which generate electricity directly from sunlight via an electronic process and can be used to power anything from small electronics such as calculators and road signs up to homes and large commercial businesses. Secondly, solar heating and cooling, or as I'll refer to it as SHC, and concentrating solar power, CSP, applications. These both use the heat generated by the sun to provide space or water heating in the case of SHC systems, or to run traditional energy generating turbines in the case of CSP power plants. This energy gathered can be used for a variety of uses, and it is used domestically, commercially, and or industrially.
Okay, very cool. So how would you say that solar energy is used?
Solar energy is a very flexible technology. The way that most of the general public is familiar with is distributed generation, which is electricity produced at or near the point where it is used. This is more commonly known as rooftop solar. There are also utility-scale solar power plants, which commonly have built-in storage capacity.
So what exactly do you mean when you say storage capacity?
That's a great question. I'd like to elaborate on solar and storage as a whole, seeing that energy storage plays a very important role in the U.S. solar industry and energy markets. Storage plays a large role in the further advancements of solar as well. Federal, state, and local policymakers are making decisions now that will dictate to what extent storage can be and will be used as the grid diversifies and electricity demand increases. States with higher storage penetrations will lead a trend in solar energy. Ultimately, the two have a symbiotic relationship, meaning wide-scale adoption of solar will lead to the wide-scale adoption of storage, which will in turn lead to more opportunities to deploy solar. They create business opportunities for one another. Energy storage can smooth electricity prices. The price of lithium-ion batteries, which is the most common type of storage paired with solar, has fallen rapidly as manufacturing has scaled up to support both electric grid and vehicle applications.
So what I've gathered is that the more successful that storage projects are, the more realistic that solar energy can be heavily utilized. Is this correct?
This is correct. This is a major spot of research, and every week we see more solar and store announcements. I'm very excited for what's to come.
Awesome. So, I had no idea that this extensive amount of research was going on. The sun is only out for part of the day, and we obviously need energy at all hours, so it makes sense that storage would be the main concern. Can you give us some examples of new announcements that you've heard?
Yes, of course. Arizona Public Service will add a 50-megawatt battery system paired with a new 65-megawatt solar plant to its fleet. The regulated utility signed a 15-year power purchase agreement, and the plant should be up and running in 2021.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Also, in January 2018, an Xcel Energy solicitation in Colorado set a new solar and storage record after attracting a median price of only $36 per megawatt per hour. According to market research firm IHS, the global energy storage market is growing exponentially to an annual installation size of 6 gigawatts in 2017 and over 40 gigawatts in 2022. From an initial base of only 0.34 gigawatts installed in 2012 and 2013, this is an extremely significant expansion in solar.
Yeah, that is a pretty significant increase, and it's all very exciting. This research going into solar and storage must mean that there are a significant amount of upsides to this renewable energy source, correct?
The list goes on and on with pros for solar energy. Notably, solar energy is renewable, abundant, sustainable, and environmentally friendly. We can't run out of solar energy, as opposed to sources like fossil fuels, coal, and nuclear. Not only can we not run out of it, but the surface of the Earth receives 20,000 times more power than what is needed to supply the entire world. And that's good as long as the sun is alive, which, according to NASA, is 6.5 billion years. An abundant and renewable energy source also means that it's sustainable. Energy meets the needs of the present without compromising the availability of future generations to meet their needs. On top of this, harnessing solar energy generally doesn't cause pollution either.
Very nice. It is clear that solar energy reduces our dependence on non-renewable energy sources,
Indeed.
which is an important step in fighting the climate crisis, right?
Yes, indeed it is. There are also individual benefits. Solar is silent. There are no moving parts involved, so there's no noise, as opposed to, say, wind turbines. Government and state rebates have also become available both on utility scale and for the majority of homeowners. This means that the effective cost of solar panels are much less than what they used to be. In some cases, the price of a residential system can be cut more than 50%. As of December 31st, 2008, the U.S. government offers a 30% tax credit with no upper limit. This is a big step towards affordability concerns. They also have low maintenance costs, with cleanings only required a couple times per year.
Dang. You know, it really doesn't seem like there's any downsides to this solar stuff.
It certainly appears that way, doesn't it? There are a few ways to improve, though. A couple of notable cons that are associated with it are expense, storage, and space. The most debated topic is undoubtedly how expensive solar is, and a lot of it lies in politics. Solar power is incentivized to compete against other energy sources on the market. On the other hand, the U.S. government, similarly to the rest of the world, provides incentives to every major energy production market, not just solar. In 2010, solar received $968 billion in federal subsidies. On average, it costs $12,810 to install residential solar panels. That's a large investment, and panels are not transferable if a family chooses to move houses. The problem here is that there is little tangible return seen by customers. All that's visible to them is that large upfront cost. This certainly lowers residential interests and usage. A second con is storage, which I touched on earlier. Solar energy is an intermittent energy source. Access to sunlight is limited to the time of day, and predicting overcast days can be difficult. Compared to wind, though, it is less intermittent. Because of this intermittency, storage is what smooths access to this energy. Batteries and other storage systems that helped with this are currently expensive and not at the level needed for practical use. This is why I stressed developments in storage so much earlier. They're heavily dependent on one another.
You know, you better be careful with how much you're bashing the wind. Otherwise, our resident expert, Catherine, is going to give you what's for later.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll fight it out back. All right, a third concern is the space solar farms require. Power density is essential when looking at how much power can be derived from a certain area of real estate of an energy source. Low power density indicates that too much real estate is required to provide the power we demand at reasonable prices. The global mean power density for solar radiation is 170 watts per meter squared. This is more than any renewable energy source, but not comparable to oil, gas, and nuclear power. This makes sense, though, seeing that parts of the world get significantly less sun than others, resulting in more solar panels required to power space. Until recently, there was a lot of wasted space with farms, bringing criticism from nature activists. The debate of the line between the importance of renewable energy versus land sustainability is ongoing. This is actually an extremely fascinating new way solar energy is working to improve all-around sustainability. Mind if I go on a tangent about this?
Absolutely, go right ahead.
Great. Firstly, are you familiar with the alarming bee population decreases?
I think I've heard about it. Something about colony collapse. I don't know, but you know, just explain it to me.
Yeah. So I won't go too in-depth just to avoid that tangent. But essentially, since the late 1990s, beekeepers around the world have observed sudden disappearances of bees and report unusually high rates of declines in honeybee colonies. The loss of biodiversity is mainly due to monocultures and pesticides. Bees and pollinating insects play an essential role in ecosystems. In fact, a third of all of our food depends on their pollination, so this is clearly a problem that deserves addressing. A research study was done in the UK to address this problem and see if solar farms could have an impact on biodiversity. The research focused on 4 key indicators: botany, specifically butterflies and bumblebees, birds, and bats, assessing both species diversity and abundance in each case. To assess changes in biodiversity relating to the solar farms, they compared wildlife in the solar farms to wildlife at a control plot nearby that was under the same management as the solar farm prior to its construction. This was to give an indication of the wildlife levels before the solar farm was constructed. The results of the botanical surveys revealed that overall solar farms had greater diversity than control plots. This greater diversity was partly the result of reseeding of the solar farms, where species-rich wildflower mixes had been sown. This diversity was greater, but even where agricultural grass mixes had been used, diversity was greater as compared to the largely arable control plots. The invertebrate surveys revealed that butterflies and bumblebees were in greater abundance on solar farms than on control plots, and the greatest number occurred where the botanical diversity was also high. At survey sites, the greater diversity of bumblebee species was also observed. The survey revealed higher levels of bat and bird activity. This has been such an innovative way to address a slight flaw in an otherwise positive energy source and really capitalize on it for bettering of global ecology.
Truly incredible.
Undoubtedly a step in the right direction. Now, these strategies are more prevalent in the UK, but are gaining popularity. There are even ways consumers can support this mission. There are companies like Bolton Bees who have partnered with solar developers with pollinator-friendly solar arrays who sell, quote-unquote, solar honey. This honey is exclusively extracted from the solar locations in order to bring awareness to the mission and providing a healthy habitat for pollinators.
Well, I certainly think I know where I'm getting my next batch of honey from. For all our listeners who are interested, we've put a link to Bolton Bees' website where you can learn more about their mission as well as purchase solar honey. So, Elle, I feel like I don't see solar farms driving through the plains like I do the way I see wind power, nor do I know anyone with residential solar. Is this energy very prevalent right now?
That's a great point, Chris. Solar can definitely be improved, but we are already starting to see steps of improvement. Global installed capacity for solar-powered electricity has seen an exponential growth, reaching around 227 gigawatts at the end of 2015. It produced 1% of all electricity used globally. Some regions are more advanced than others. Like in 2016, Europe had a 43.7% solar installed capacity, followed by East Asia at 35.2%. We're lagging a little bit behind here in North America with only 13.2% installed capacity. Still, over the last decade, the solar markets in the United States have grown at an average rate of 50% each year, and there are nearly 2 million individual solar installations in the U.S.
With all the positives associated with this sustainable energy source, why do you think usage isn't higher globally?
Yeah, well, on the consumer side, present biases of economic agents gets in the way. Yes, solar can have a large role in reducing future carbon emissions, but this is not a tangible return seen by customers. We have a hard time making decisions in the present in which we will only see returns in the future. All we see now is this large upfront cost of panel installation. There has also been criticism that homeowners consider solar panels to be an unsightly home addition.
So how do you propose that we get consumers to see the many benefits and not worry about how ugly their homes look afterwards?
So there are a few nudges to counteract these present biases. For example, Google has a solar saving estimator where you can type in your address and see how much you could save by switching to solar. When an address in Yuma, Arizona is put in, a homeowner can see that $6,000 a year can be saved when switching to solar. This gives consumers a tangible number and current benefit to see right in front of them. The main issue right now is it is only economically efficient for a consumer to install solar panels in the sunniest parts of America, aka Yuma. If we keep advancing this technology, however, this Google Solar Savings Estimator will become a more effective tool, and this energy form will become more realistic and attainable for residential homes.
That really makes me wonder how much I could be saving. I guess I'll have to check that out after we wrap up.
Definitely.
One final thing, though, before we run out of time. Speaking of the future, what do you predict solar energy will look like in the coming years?
Solar power is in a constant state of innovation, with new advances announced weekly. We've made enormous strides so far as efficiency. In 1954, solar panels were 6% efficient. In 2012, one was 14% efficient, and today the current record is 23.5%. It doesn't stop there, though. MIT researchers announced new technology that could double the efficiency of solar cells overall. They revealed a concept that captures and utilizes the waste heat that is usually emitted by solar panels. This non-harnessed thermal energy is a setback and huge opportunity for improvement. This innovation could help the cost of solar panels plummet even further. As far as the unsightly look of typical panels, MIT startup Sistine Solar is making major strides with the concept of an aesthetic enhancement that allows solar panels to have a customized look. They have created solar skin, which makes it possible for panels to match the appearance of a roof without interfering with panel efficiency. This should aid in greater consumer interest. Another new development is solar-powered roads. Last summer, the sidewalks along Route 66 were used as a testing location. They not only generate clean energy, but also include LED light bulbs that can light roads at night and have the thermal heating capacity to melt snow during the winter. The next step is to install them on designated segments of Road 66. I could go on, because like I said earlier, new developments and technology announcements have occurred weekly in 2019. So, what do I see in the future? Don't be surprised if in the near future you're hearing more and more word about how this renewable energy source is fantastic.
Thank you so much for coming in, Al.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris.
No problem. And now a quick word from our sponsors. Our first sponsor of the day is the color green. Beautiful, inspiring, invigorating. Green is the color of life, wealth, and of not stopping at intersections. From hunter to emerald, and from lime to neon, all green should be embraced around the world. Thank you, green, and now back to your energies. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the Green Energy Cast. I'm your host, Chris, and with us today we have Tony, our expert on geothermal energy. Hey there, Tony. How you doing?
Hey, Chris. Today I will just be here to talk about geothermal energy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't you start off by explaining to the listeners what geothermal energy actually is?
Okay. So geothermal energy is defined as the heat from within the earth that can be used for heating or to generate electricity. It is produced due to the fission of the radioactive materials in the earth core and some place inside the earth which become very hot.
Okay.
So they cause water deep inside of the earth to form steam.
Okay. Interesting. So there's fission going on in some elements deep inside the earth. This generates some heat. And how can we actually use this heat? How is it helpful to us?
Okay, so geothermal energy can be used for heat pumps and also power plants.
Okay.
So heat pumps, apparently it's going to be used for heating and cooling. So it is also known as the ground source, that our system that use the stable temperature of the earth to heat and cool buildings. So like a few feet below the surface of the earth, the temperature stays at about like 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It is stable, so when geothermal heat pumps use the heat, it is a relatively constant temperature to both heat and cool the buildings and houses.
Okay, thanks for that. You were talking about the heat pumps there, but didn't you also mention a way to get electrical power from geothermal as well?
Yeah, so geothermal power plants are the ways to generate electricity through the geothermal energy. It is that the facilities convert the Earth's natural heat into electricity through plant drill plants. These plants drill wells into geothermal resources to bring hot water and steam from deep within the Earth to the surface. And all geothermal power plants use steam to spin turbines attached to the electricity generators. They use the water and steams to make the plants work, and they will generate electricity, so on.
Okay. So geothermal sounds like it's pretty interesting. Does the United States use geothermal at all, or are there some countries that use geothermal more than others?
Yeah, not that many countries use geothermal energy. America doesn't use it a lot, but Iceland uses it a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, Iceland uses 50% of its total energy from the geothermal energy, which is quite a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, 68% of the primary energy of Iceland is like produced by renewable energy sources, but like 50% of them are like geothermal energy, which is quite a lot.
Okay, so Iceland is using a lot of renewable as well as geothermal? Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Now, why is geothermal not used widely around the entire world?
Well, because it's really location specific. So if you have a really great spot that can like plant like build the plants to generate heat through the geothermal energy, that's great. Like Iceland is like a perfect spot for them to like extract heat from the underneath the surface of the earth.
Okay.
Yeah. However, like say like if in Asia or like in like America, it's kind of hard to like do so because the location is different. So
Okay.
yeah.
And this is because there's just not geothermal hotspots underneath the
Yeah,
ground,
yeah,
right?
yeah. There's only like 64 countries around the world that enjoys the geothermal energy.
Okay. Okay. So that would have to be one of the disadvantages of geothermal,
Yeah,
right? That it's
yeah,
very
exactly.
location specific.
Yeah.
What are some of the other disadvantages or advantages that geothermal has?
So yeah, since we talk about the disadvantages, I would just say that it's also really hard to be installed sometimes, because like if you apart from the those industries who would build the geothermal systems, if you want a really good geothermal systems by yourself, like you own it, like it's hard because like you need a house and then you need a piece of land that like next to your house, so you can build like a geothermal system for your house to be cooled or to be heated.
Okay.
Which is really hard in the big cities, right? Because you
Yeah.
can't just have big buildings and have another piece of land right next to your building. Other things are like it has a really high greenhouse gas emission. Normally, when geothermal energy is used, when it's extracted, carbon dioxide is the major air pollution there, and with some hydrogen sulfide, which
Okay.
is kind of harmful in the air.
Mm-hmm.
So apart from other environmental issues, air pollution is the major issue for
Okay.
geothermal energy.
Now, I thought geothermal energy was just using hot water or heat from underneath the ground to generate steam for electricity. Where do all of these greenhouse gases come from?
Yeah, so because when you use geothermal energy, when you generate the electricity and stuff from the below the surface, it will actually bring up the minerals that's
Okay.
stored in the underneath of the earth.
Mhm.
So they will then when the water evaporates into the steam, those carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide will be emitted.
So it's kind of like when you open up a can of pop, where there's
Yeah.
carbon dioxide in the water. When you let that pressure go and you release the steam, then you also release all of the other gases that are in the water.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And it's not the greatest, but there's some advantages for geothermal, right? What would you say are some of those?
So it is really efficient compared to those like conventional systems for heating and cooling. Geothermal systems are like 25% to 50% more efficient by using the same amount of electricity.
So using geothermal for heating and cooling of houses is more efficient than, say, a traditional furnace or something like that?
Yeah, if you want to save more electricity, that's like a better way.
Okay.
And also, it's a really reliable source because it's just the heat coming from the earth, right? So as long as the earth exists, the heat will exist.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a really sustainable energy, and it's renewable forever.
Okay, great. Thanks for explaining some of those advantages of the heating for the geothermal pumps. But would you say that there are any advantages for the electrical generation of geothermal power?
Yes, there are some advantages. One of the most valuable advantages is that geothermal energy, they can generate energy constantly without any stops. For example, if you use solar energy or like wind energies, like if they don't have winds, if they don't have any sunlight, then it will be stopped, right? But for geothermal energy, it's gonna be consistently generating electricity from the geothermal energy in the ground, because the energy will exist forever. So whenever you use it, you can use it for a constant period of time.
Okay.
And also, talking about the advantages, just then I talk about how greenhouse gases emission is a issue, but actually the fact is that apart from the greenhouse gas emission, it is really environmentally friendly because it doesn't really generate any other pollutions at all.
Okay. Yeah, and it's not like it's creating these greenhouse gases. It's just releasing them from where they were beforehand.
Yeah. So say like if the emissions were really slow, it's just like speed up the emissions because they are extracted.
They would have
faster.
came out anyways,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So one final question that I would ask you is, how does geothermal help or hurt botany as a whole? You know, does it have any advantages for botany? Does it have any disadvantages for plants across the world? What do you have to say about that?
For the advantages for botany, like for the plants, one of the thing is it's location specific. So for example, for like if you have the perfect hotspot here, you will just build the plants here instead of like going to find a place where like there are a lot of plants and forests you need to harvest them in order to build it. Because if you don't have the hotspot, you can't build it anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing is that although I actually have a carbon dioxide emission, but it's actually much lower than those of like traditional energies, such as like burning coals. Yeah, it's much lower of the carbon dioxide emission.
So even if it does produce some greenhouse gases, it's not as bad as if you were, say, burning coal or natural gas.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good.
Yeah, that's a good thing. So one last thing is, just as the other green energies, it helps you to offset the global warming because it reduces the pollution emissions.
Okay.
So actually do helps a lot.
Okay, awesome. Well, Tony, I think that's about all the time that we have, but I thank you for coming in very much.
Thank you, Chris.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Normally, you might expect to hear about Honey or Bumble as services and apps on the internet. Well, today, I'm here to tell you about Buzz, the only social media platform that donates 100% of its proceeds to helping bees around the world. You can find out more in the link below. Thank you to Buzz for supporting the show. Now let's get back to green energy. Thanks for tuning in to Green Energy. This is your host, Elle. Today we have expert Chris, and he's going to tell us a little bit about nuclear energy. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Al.
Of course.
So I guess we should probably start off with a little bit of background information about what nuclear energy is, where it came from, just so that way our listeners have a better understanding of just the overall view of it. So back in 1905, Albert Einstein proposed this idea that was pretty radical for the time, that energy and matter were one and the same, and that you could go from energy to matter pretty, well, not easily, I should say, but you can do it, and it generates a fair bit of energy for a small amount of matter. This was basically the opening of the door for nuclear power as well as nuclear weapons, unfortunately. The first nuclear reactor was actually opened in Chicago on December 2nd, 1942, and it was opened as part of the Manhattan Project. The original purpose for nuclear reactors was actually to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. That was one of the ways that they were used, because one of the products of nuclear fusion, or fission I should say, is weapons-grade plutonium. For the first actual use of power generation that nuclear energy was used for was used in submarines, actually. So nuclear subs were developed so that way submarines could stay underneath water for longer and they wouldn't have to come into port to fuel up with gasoline or diesel fuel or anything like that. And now nuclear power as we know it today operates by nuclear fission, which is when a nucleus of an atom is split, and this splitting releases a large amount of energy. That's a brief overview. Is there anything you think I could go into more depth on?
Yeah, could you tell me a little bit more about what kinds of nuclear power there are?
Yeah, for sure. So the most common source of nuclear power that we have nowadays is nuclear fission, which is where you split that nucleus of an atom. There's also two other main forms of nuclear power that we have thought about. One of them isn't very well thought of, so we won't go into it, but the other one is nuclear fusion. It's this pie-in-the-sky idea. It's how our sun actually works, by fusing atoms together instead of breaking them apart. It releases a lot more energy, and it could be a great way for us to further the study of nuclear power, but as of right now, it's out of our reach. We're definitely trying to get a hold of it.
All right, great, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. How are we using fusion today?
Great question. Glad you asked it. There are three main models of fuel reactor that are used for fusion reactions. And before I get into the types of reactors, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the parts of a nuclear reactor. So the first thing that you have is obviously a fuel source. Most reactors currently use uranium for their fuel source. It's a special isotope of uranium called uranium-235. And this isotope splits apart, it releases neutrons, and these neutrons can be used to further the reaction and have it be called sustainable. Now, the problem is that when those nuclei split and they release these neutrons, they come out too fast. It's like, imagine throwing a baseball and you're trying to get somebody to hit it. If you throw it too fast, it's going to be way hard for them to hit it. So instead, what you need to do is you slow those neutrons down. You use a moderator to call that. And most reactors use water as the moderator. It does a really good job at slowing the neutrons down. Some reactors use graphite, but those are few and far in between. Another thing that a reactor needs is coolant, because reactors get hot. They're releasing energy. They need something to cool them down, otherwise you'll get problems later on. One of the nice things about using water as a moderator is you can also use it as a coolant for the reactor itself. That helps keep it cool and helps the reaction from going critical. Another thing that you need is called a control rod. This is basically something to stop neutrons if they get a little too excited. The problem is that if you have too many neutrons going at once, you're basically creating a bomb, because a nuclear bomb works by spontaneous and uncontrolled release of neutrons to generate a lot of energy very quickly in the form of an explosion. So control rods, very important for slowing down the process. And then the last thing that you need is some way to generate power from this heat that you're producing. Typically, it's in the form of a steam turbine where you heat water hot enough that it boils, and then you can use that to drive a turbine, and that powers an electrical generator. Those are the main parts of the reactor. Anything you want me to go into more detail on?
Could you go into detail about the pros and cons of each type of reactor?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Al. There's actually three main types of reactors I'm going to talk about, and then I will talk about the pros and cons of each. The three main types of reactors are as follows: boiling water reactors, pressurized water reactors, and pressurized heavy water reactors. Boiling water reactors are one of the most common. They make up about 25% of all the reactors in the world, I think.
Interesting.
And they are the most simple form as well. Basically, you have nuclear fuel rods sitting in a big bath of water. The bath of water heats up, and then this heat turns it into steam. The steam is captured in a steam turbine, and then it's turned into power. Then we can go on to a pressurized water reactor, which is where you have water at a very high pressure that's not allowed to turn into steam. This is circulated through and cooled off by a separate bath of water. That water turns into steam, and then it is able to drive a turbine and generate power. And then finally, you have pressurized heavy water reactors, which is the same thing as a pressurized water reactor. The only difference is that instead of using normal water like you and I drink, it's using heavy water, which is just normal water, except instead of having hydrogens, as in H2O, it has an isotope of hydrogen called deuterium. All that heavy water does in the reactor is help slow down neutrons even more effectively than normal water does. Then you asked about the pros and cons of each, and I'll go into that a little bit. Boiling water reactors have the main benefit of their simplicity, but the problem that they have is that they're in direct contact with the water that's used to cool them. And so if there's a need to vent the pressure in the system, or if something happens like in Fukushima where the containment walls break, then you can release irradiated particles out into wherever the water ends up leaking to. So that's one of the biggest problems with boiling water reactors. But one of the biggest things that it has going for it is that it has lower pressures. Nothing's pressurized, so you don't have a bomb basically waiting to explode.
That's always good.
Yeah, exactly. There's less strain on parts, there's lower temperatures overall, and there's less likelihood of ruptures. Pressurized water reactors, on the other hand, they keep the nuclear fuel rods away from the water that's used to generate steam. So you don't have to worry about containment breaches and then nuclear particles getting out into the world.
Perfect.
Cons, though, high pressure. There's a lot of stress, a lot of likelihood of failures, things going wrong. And then you also have some corrosive things that are used inside of them, which can also lead to higher stress and higher levels of failure. heavy water reactors that are pressurized have basically the same problems as normal pressure reactors. The only major difference is that heavy water is expensive. It's almost as expensive as the uranium that's used to fuel it. So if you had some sort of a leak, or you needed to do a refill, or you needed to build a new reactor, there's a lot of cost associated with that. However, while there is a high cost associated with heavy water pressure reactors, the fuel that is used to fuel them is significantly cheaper because the heavy water reactors are more efficient. So you don't need to refine the uranium that you used. So while the heavy water is more expensive, the fuel is less expensive. So it offsets itself a little bit there. And those, I would say, are the main pros and cons of each. Do you have any more questions about those?
I think you covered
Okay.
everything that I would like to know. Can you tell us why nuclear power is good as a whole, and also can go into some of the downsides?
Absolutely, yeah. So, as I've already been talking about, nuclear energy has a lot of very complicated aspects that go around with it. You have nuclear waste, you have nuclear contaminants that could get out into the atmosphere, but then you also have the pros of low carbon emissions to no carbon emissions and things like that. And these all combine to make nuclear power one of the best energies that we have available to us currently, but also one of the ones that has the highest level of stigma to go with it.
Indeed.
So some of the pros that go with it is that nuclear power is very, very efficient. I pulled up a statistic that said that over the past 6 years, nuclear power plants in the United States have had a capacity factor of over 85%.
Interesting.
Now, for our listeners out there that don't know what a capacity factor is, basically it is the energy that was output by a fuel source divided by the maximum theoretical energy that could be output by that fuel source. So if nuclear power generators put out 100 watts of power, and they could have put out 150 watts of power, that means that they have a capacity factor of about 66%. Nuclear power had a capacity factor of 85%. So that means that 85% of the theoretical limit that it could produce, it did, which is much better than other green energy sources. I believe that solar and wind were about 50% or less, but geothermal was around 75%. And some of the things that lead into that are the fact that, take wind energy. It's not always windy. Sometimes it's too windy, and you can't have it running all the time. Solar energy, there's not always sunshine outside. It could be cloudy. It could possibly be nighttime. I can tell that Elle is getting a little upset because I'm kind of taking a stab at her energy source over there, but she'll have her time to rebuttal later.
We know about storing energy, so we'll get into that another time.
We do know about storing energy, but that's actually one of the biggest pros that nuclear power has for it. We don't have to store the energy. It can always be producing. It can be increased in production. It can be decreased in production. It's very similar to coal or natural gas in that regard, where you can increase how much energy is being produced by the reactor at any given time. So say it's game day in Madison and you need a little bit more power, you can just pull the control rods out a little bit further of the reactor and it'll start generating more power. If it's nighttime and no one's doing anything out in a rural country, you slam those control rods down in and all of a sudden the reactor is producing at 10%. But the power grid is only needing 50% of its normal power output. So you don't need to worry about having too much or too little power at any given time. And then obviously one of the biggest pros that it has going for it is that it's the largest zero emissions energy producer in the United States currently. And that's, as it stands today, 2019. So these are the main pros that nuclear has going for it, but obviously there are cons as well. Potentially dangerous situations like Fukushima or Chernobyl.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm hearing all these pros, but in the news all I'm hearing about is 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl.
Yep. Yes.
What happened there?
There are some pretty big downsides that go with it. A few accidents were notable, to be fair. 3 Mile Island is one that a lot of people remember. This happened in 1979. It was a pressurized water reactor. What happened was an operator error caused a loss of cooling in the in the actual reactor core, and radioactive materials were released to a small area around the reactor. There were no reported injuries or death, but there was a large amount of, I would say, confusion and furor around the event. People were very unhappy and they didn't want to go back near the reactor. Even to this day, the reactor that melted down is still shut down, even though it has been repaired and it could be operational again. People just don't want to see it running because there is a stigma against it now. Chernobyl, you mentioned, was 1986. It was a rather strange design because the American design that's used mostly in the United States is slightly different than the Russian design, and that's just because they went two different routes. It was one of the worst nuclear accidents of all time, caused by a failed safety test, actually, where the test was designed to see how well the reactor could perform at critical conditions. So they shut down multiple safety systems, they disabled the reactor, and they allowed it to run at unstable conditions for multiple hours. And then a steam explosion led to the graphite-based moderator, which I mentioned earlier, catching fire. And then eventually 30 workers ended up dying within a few weeks, and approximately 7,000 cases of thyroid cancer were reported up to the current day. Now we'll move on to the most recent one that's on people's minds, which is Fukushima. And Fukushima was pretty crazy because it was basically a series of unfortunate events. Nothing like this was ever expected to happen, and people warned of potential shortcomings in the safety systems, and nobody wanted to listen to them. A 9.0 earthquake shut down all of the reactors that were currently running at Fukushima, and it also killed power to all cooling systems for the reactors. Then a 13-meter tall wave passed over the guard walls, and it flooded the facility, ruining all the backup generators that were supplying power to the reactors or to the backup generators, so that way they could attempt to cool the system down. Because nothing was being cooled, the cores began to melt down. They released hydrogen gas, which proceeded to explode. This caused significant damage. It injured workers. It released radioactive compounds. It just wasn't good. It wasn't good at all. But there are some important things to take away from all three of these accidents. All of them were man-made disasters. All of them. 3 Mile Island was because an operator misread a readout on his display. Chernobyl was because they purposely put the reactor in a dangerous position, and Fukushima was actually the biggest example of a man-made mistake. Warnings for the flood barriers being too short were given years in advance. The reactors were shut down. They wouldn't have overheated, but technicians were afraid that they wouldn't be able to start the reactors back up after the fact, and so they overrode the shutdown. Then the generators lost power, and they weren't able to turn the reactors back off after the fact because they had no power in the system. So everything that went wrong could have been avoided in most of these cases had just a little bit more care been taken. Other things to consider is the fact that all of these accidents were on older generation models that in the modern day, most of these problems wouldn't have been a problem with newer, more modern reactor technology.
Very unfortunate accidents indeed. Those were man-made accidents, and I understand that. But what about nuclear waste and radiation?
Yeah, so that's one of the other big stigmas against nuclear power is all the nuclear waste that everybody wants to talk about. What's being done with it? Where's it going? Are we going to do anything with it? Are we just going to shove it underneath the ground? And the answer is that there isn't really an answer right now. People don't want to talk about it too much. People want to just kind of push it off for later. Some facts about the nuclear waste issue, though, is that there's not that much of it that exists. All of it could be contained within a single football field to a depth of 10 yards, which sounds like it might be a lot because it's an entire football field. But when you consider the fact that this is all the nuclear waste that's been generated over the past 50 years, 60 years, it's not that much. Some research has been done into reprocessing it, to trying to re-extract some of the more dangerous radioactive elements and use them in current nuclear reactors. France is currently the world leader in recycling of nuclear energy, or nuclear waste, I should say. But in America, there are rules and regulations against doing that, so we currently don't. People also think that it's not economically viable to do so. So because of those reasons, we don't reprocess any of the fuel. We're still waiting on a potential resting place for the rest of the fuel to go. A mountain out in the far west was chosen, but it has not been approved for storage of nuclear fuel waste yet. So we are currently waiting on that problem, and it is a problem, and it's something that we have to consider very shortly here because it is getting to be bigger and bigger as time goes on.
So do you think nuclear power can help botany, or how, overall, can it improve sustainability?
Yeah, so sustainability with nuclear power is definitely one of the biggest things that it has going for it. Nuclear power, as I said already, is a zero net carbon producer. Doesn't produce any form of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases, and we have it now. The technology does exist. So if global warming is really as big of an issue as everyone says that it is, using this power, this energy source that we have that doesn't produce any form of greenhouse gases, we should be investing more into it. We should be trying to push it as far as we can so that way we can reduce the threat of global warming. And, what does global warming cause? Well, it causes the increase in temperature, and plants don't really like to be put out of their normal temperature zones. Neither do animals, neither do humans, neither does anything really on the planet. Reducing global warming will help every facet of the world, from botany to animal husbandry to everything that you can imagine. One of the other benefits that nuclear energy has for botany as a whole is the fact that it's very environmentally friendly to habitat loss. Nuclear reactors are very small and self-contained. They don't take up a lot of space. You don't need to cut down entire forests to make room for mines to dig up coal or to make room for solar fields to produce a large amount of power. A similar amount of power can be produced in a very small area with reactors, as well as the fact that they can also be built in fairly inhospitable environments, meaning they don't need to be encroaching on other natural habitats or human developments. They can be put far away from people, they can be put far away from resources, and the power can be shipped in from there, so that way they can have as little impact as possible.
Very nice. Well, this seems like a great sustainable form of energy. Do you see nuclear advancing more in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. Currently, we're using reactor with generations 1 to 3. Generations in the past were focused on very different things than what we should be focused on now, whether that be plutonium production or whether that be just basic short lifespans of these reactors. Generations 3 plus are currently being designed, and they're being designed to surpass the current Generation 3 reactors. Generation 2 reactors have a lifespan of about 40 to 60 plus years. With current Generation 3 plus reactors, they're expecting to be at least 60 years lived and could be as long as 100 plus years before they need any sort of major maintenance or repair. Also, they're being designed to use uranium more efficiently, so that way we have to do less digging and refining of current uranium. And then Generation 4 reactors are already in the works, where they're meant to reduce the radioactive lifespan of the nuclear waste produced down from millennia to centuries. They're also meant to increase the yield from fuel by up to 300 times. They offer more diverse fuel types to be used, and in some cases they can even use current nuclear waste to try and reduce the problem that we have. Not only will we be looking at future fission technologies, we'll also be looking into fusion technologies. One of the largest experiments that's being run currently is being developed in Switzerland by ITER, and it's called the tokamak, which is basically trying to create nuclear fusion on the Earth, which could be revolutionary when it comes to power production. And as far as other advances goes, we'll just have to wait and see.
Well, I'm excited to find out. That sounds super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so our time's coming to an end. Do you have any closing thoughts before we sign off?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that overall, nuclear power is one of the best, most sustainable resources that we have available to us. It's currently here. The technology exists, and with just a little bit of refinement and a little bit of public education, we could teach people that it's not something to be feared and stigmatized. Instead, it could be something that could help lead us into a brighter, greener future. Not only that, but it's better than solar.
Oh, we'll go into that another time. All right, thanks, Chris, for all your information. That was great.
Thank you, El. Nature. You know it, you love it, and now it's sponsoring this show. For millions of years, nature has been supporting and fighting with life across the world, but now we're teaming up to bring you, well, this podcast. Don't look too far into it. It's not important. Just know that nature is one of our sponsors for today, and you can find out more down in the description. Now, back to the show.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning back into Green Energy. Today we have Jeff. He's going to tell us all about hydropower. Start it off, Jeff.
So, well, basically put, hydropower is generated through harnessing the movement of flowing water. This flowing water creates energy that can be captured and turned into electricity. It's actually a form of energy supply that has a really long history. We've been using concepts of it since the pre-industrial revolution era. People used to build sawmills by rivers and use the flow of the river to basically get the whole mill to function. These early forms of hydropower use are a lot more different from how we use it today. The kind of medieval hydropower mills, they were just used to get the gears of a machine to work. But today it's something very different.
So how would you say it's different today?
So, well, today we're so dependent on the use of electricity, so the main function of hydropower facilities are to create and store electricity. Going to more specific detail, most hydropower plants today use a dam on a river to store water in a reservoir. This water, most of it is actually trapped, but some of it is released, and as the water flows through the dam, the kinetic energy of the water is actually used to turn a turbine. A generator inside the hydropower plant then takes the mechanical energy produced by the turbine and converts it into electricity we can use. According to a study done by the Dutch scientists M. Mekonnen and A. Hoekstra, hydropower accounts for 16% of the world's energy supply. In the United States alone, it accounts for 10% of the nation's energy.
Very interesting. So you mentioned that hydropower is considered a renewable resource. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So as we already know, a renewable resource is something that can be used repeatedly and it is replenished by natural means. So not only does hydropower not pollute the air, it doesn't burn any fuels and such, but it relies on the Earth's natural water cycle to generate energy. It's essentially a really good concept when you're talking purely about the production of electricity alone. But there are certainly a lot of downfalls, particularly environmental impacts. After all, hydropower plants are to some extent manipulating a natural phenomenon to the benefit of people, which will undoubtedly cause environmental implications.
Well, you can't expect every green energy to be perfect, but can you go into a little bit more detail about the negatives of this particular energy source?
Sure. So the first one I'd like to discuss isn't directly related to the environment, but it is important nonetheless. So ironically, reservoir construction is drying up in the U.S. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to construct a dam. So let's just put Hoover Dam into perspective. It's huge. Going back to the point, by now most of the spots which are actually appropriate to build dams are all taken up. So in this sense, the construction of hydropower plants are limited. You can't really build them wherever you want to. So adding on to this, reservoirs do obviously cause water levels to rise up and can flood the surrounding areas. Especially, I like to talk about the Three Gorges Dam in southern China. This had a huge human impact and environmental impact, and people were forced to move from their homes, and just the whole area flooded and the whole place became uninhabitable. As I said, the rising water levels not only disrupts human activity, but also wildlife and ecological systems around the reservoir. Hydropower plants have been known to also disrupt fish wildlife as they can restrict their passages and lead to fish entrapment. But what I'd really like to focus on today is how hydropower is reliant on the hydrology system. At the basic level, hydropower depends on precipitation levels and can fail to function properly if there's, a drought or something. But as you can imagine, these huge reserves of water are not naturally occurring and can give rise to what's known as the blue water footprint.
So, I feel like most people have heard of carbon footprints, green energy footprints, but I've never heard of a blue water footprint. Can you go into a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, no problem. The blue water footprint is essentially an analysis of the volume of surface and groundwater consumed in the production of a good or service. So in the context of hydropower plants, this service entails providing electricity to the public. So going back to the topic at hand, I like to refer back to the study done by Mekonnen and Hoekstra. They actually propose a question which I believe is really important, whether or not hydropower plants actually consume water or not. Traditionally speaking, the consumption of water in hydropower plants is not a huge consideration during the construction, and that it has historically been considered that hydropower plants are non-consumptive users of water, an aspect Mekonnen and Hoekstra would like to revise. They found that in their study that throughout the 35 chosen research sites alone, that the water lost from evaporation is equivalent to 10% of the blue water footprint produced from crop production. And remember, this data is only considering 8% of the world's hydropower supply.
Interesting.
So, what does this massive blue water footprint actually mean? Well, it has a huge implication on the natural hydrology cycle. It's highly disruptive to the environment simply because it consumes so much water. So one really good example of this is actually the drying Aral Sea in Central Asia. It's one of the biggest ecological disasters caused by river diversion, and essentially what's happening is this entire sea is evaporating. Typically, evaporation from the sea is matched by inflows of water by certain rivers. However, the hydrological cycle is quite fragile. It depends heavily on the natural flow of water from mountains to larger bodies of water, and then when it evaporates into clouds, it gets carried back to the mountains again. So think about what would happen if you actually put a huge reserve of water or many different reserves of water in between this process. So, since the 1960s, the building of an extensive network of dams and canals for cotton irrigation has virtually eliminated the flow of water into the Aral Sea. So what used to be an entire ocean, well, small ocean, an entire sea, is now practically a desert as a result of dam construction and the consequent water consumption of these dams. The events at the Aral Sea are a clear example of the blue water footprint of hydropower dams. They're evidently consuming water at a certain stage in the hydrological cycle, ultimately disrupting the entire natural process. There are other ways in which dams affect the hydrological cycle as well. Some places experience periodic floods, and their local ecosystems are adapted to such an environment. These areas are actually known as floodplains. So storage dams will almost always delay floods downstream and will reduce average flood peaks, which, as you can imagine, wreaks havoc on the environments and ecosystems which are adapted to a natural periodic flood. The construction of dams also causes riverbed deepening, which lowers the groundwater tables along a river. For humans, this means we'll have to drill deeper to access groundwater. In the environmental aspect, this also lowers areas of the water table that are actually accessible to plants alongside the river, and also disrupts habitats for fish that spawn at the bottoms of rivers. I'd just like to take this moment to indicate that Mekonnen and Hoekstra don't actually propose a solution in their paper. Rather, they focus on spreading awareness about this blue water footprint because it's not so widely understood yet. There are a lot of other factors actually pouring into this so-called waste of water through hydropower plants, such as climate. So in a tropical environment, more water will evaporate. It's undeniable that these huge reserves of water, though, will cause a lot of water waste through evaporation.
Interesting. So what does this mean for the future of hydropower as a green energy source?
So, like I said, the construction of hydro plants seems to be dwindling. I certainly believe that we should be turning to more efficient sources of green energy, considering all the downfalls associated with hydropower. Even though I've been mostly focusing on the negative impacts of hydropower today, it certainly has its perks, namely that it's flexible in the sense that water flow and the consequent electricity output is easy to manipulate. It's also renewable. It's relatively safe. For example, you won't have a catastrophe at the level of Chernobyl or Fukushima in this case of a hydropower dam. And it is reliable because it does not necessarily need sunlight hours for its production of energy.
Oof.
Also, to some extent, it's green because it does not produce greenhouse gases. So I guess I'd like to say that alongside the conclusions of the scientists Mekonnen and Hoekstra, that given that we continue to build hydropower dams, we do need to take into consideration this blue water footprint. But overall, my opinion is still that I believe that we should consider other sources of green energy. The areas that reservoirs flood simply has too great of an ecological impact to be sustainable, and especially when you now pull into consideration the impact hydropower dams have on the hydrological cycle, the fact that hydropower doesn't produce greenhouse gases is kind of a Pyrrhic victory for the environment and natural processes of Earth.
Well, I certainly learned a lot that I did not know about hydropower before this. So thank you so much for enlightening me and all of our listeners. And to all our listeners, thanks again for tuning in to Green Energy.
Sure, thanks for having me.
We would like to take this sponsor slot to thank all of our dedicated listeners. From all of us here at Green Energy to all of you listening, thank you. And now, back to the show.
Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to the Green Energy Cast. I'm your host, Chris, and with me we have the lovely Catherine, who is going to be telling us a little bit about wind energy. How you doing, Catherine?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So, let's start off with the basics. Why don't you tell us a little bit about wind energy and everything that you want to say about it?
Yeah, so wind energy as a renewable resource is one of the most rapidly growing sources that produces electrical energy using wind turbines. Basically, modern wind turbines are utilized to convert kinetic energy in the wind into mechanical power. So this mechanical power can be used for specific tasks or can be converted into electricity by a generator. There are three main types of wind energy that I'd like to introduce the audience to. So first is the utility scale wind, which uses wind turbines that range in size from 100 kilowatts to several megawatts. The turbines used for utility scale wind energy are typically installed in large multi-turbine wind farms connected to the nation's transmission system. The second type of wind energy is distributed or small wind, which uses a single small wind turbine below 100 kilowatts that are used to directly power home, a farm, or small businesses. The final type of wind energy is offshore wind. This type of energy uses wind turbines that are placed in large bodies of water, usually on the continental shelf. Offshore wind turbines are larger than land-based turbines and can generate much more power.
Okay, thanks. That's a good description of all of those. Now, what would you say is the main difference between windmills and wind turbines? Because you hear that word being used or interchangeably quite often. Is there a difference?
Yes, there actually is. And a lot of people do think that they are actually very similar, but there are tons of differences between the two. Mm-hmm. People have been using windmills for centuries to grind grain, pump water, and do other work. And although windmills generate mechanical energy, they don't generate electricity. And as I stated before, wind turbines harness wind's kinetic energy and convert it into electricity. So in contrast to windmills, wind turbines are used to produce energy.
Okay, that makes sense. So if they produce energy, how do they actually do that? How do the wind turbines work?
Okay, yeah. So although the process of converting wind energy into electricity may seem simple, there's tons of parts working during this conversion. I want to start by talking about what exactly a wind turbine is, and then I'll dive into the conversion process.
Okay.
So modern wind turbines fall into two basic groups. First, there are the horizontal axis turbines, which are what many people think of when they hear about wind turbines. They most commonly have three blades that are operated upwind, with the turbine pivoting at the top of the tower, so the blades face into the wind. The other group is the vertical axis turbines. These groups of turbines come in several varieties, including the egg beater style Darius model, which was named after its French inventor. And as its name would suggest, this turbine is in the shape of an egg beater, meaning that it uses curved blades that are mounted on a vertical rotating framework. The great thing about wind turbines is that they can be built on land or offshore in large bodies of water. In regards to the conversion process, when wind blows past the wind turbines, its blades capture the wind's kinetic energy and rotates, turning it into mechanical energy. And this rotation turns on an internal shaft connecting to a gearbox, which increases the speed of rotation by a factor of 100. That spins a generator which produces electricity. So a typical modern turbine will start to generate electricity when wind speeds reach 6 to 9 miles per hour, and this is known as cut-in speed.
Okay, that makes sense. So you were mentioning some offshore wind turbines. I know that I live in Wisconsin, and I don't see these too often, and I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners probably haven't either. So can you explain a little bit more about those, maybe some research and development that's going on with them?
Yeah, definitely. So the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technologies Office funds research nationwide to enable the development and deployment of offshore wind technologies that captures wind resources off the coast of the U.S. This portfolio of research, development, and demonstration projects will help the industry overcome key barriers to offshore wind development, including the relatively high costs of energy, the mitigation of environmental impacts, the technical challenges of project installation, and grid interconnection. Offshore wind resources are abundant, stronger, and blow more consistently than land-based wind resources. Data has suggested that more than 2,000 gigawatts could be accessed in state and federal waters along the coast of the U.S. and the Great Lakes. Although not all of this resource potential will realistically be developed, the magnitude represents a substantial opportunity to generate electricity near coastal high-density population centers. With greater potential for corrosion from exposure to seawater, offshore wind systems have to be designed more robustly than land-based wind systems due to the high cost of transporting maintenance crews and replacement components to and from the offshore wind plant sites. There's also been an investment in research to understand and mitigate market barriers that limit the deployment of offshore wind in the nation's coastal regions. These barriers include those related to integrating offshore wind energy into existing grid infrastructure, limiting the extent to which offshore wind turbines interact with avian and aquatic life in the offshore environments, and ensuring that the construction of wind power is feasible through the study of our nation's available ports, vessels, and supply chain infrastructures.
Thank you for that description. It was very, very intelligent. So now let's delve into this a bit deeper and talk about some of the pros and cons of wind energy. And we can start with whichever one of those you would like.
Yeah, okay, so I will start with the pros.
Okay.
The use of wind energy has been progressively increasing in the past 30 years, and out of all the renewable energy produced in the U.S. in 2017, 21% came from wind, while just 7% came from solar power. So although we will be seeing a few disadvantages to wind energy, I believe that the advantages are much more apparent than the disadvantages. Also, much improvements have been made and currently are being made to make wind energy more desirable. The main advantage include unlimited free renewable resource, which is wind itself, economic value, maintenance costs, and placement of wind harvesting facilities. So first and foremost, wind is an unlimited free renewable source. It's a natural occurrence, and so harvesting the kinetic energy of wind won't affect currents or wind cycles in any way. Wind power is something that always exists at some level, fueled by the power of the sun. The wind blows everywhere on our planet to a certain extent. Although this does mean some locations will receive better wind energy than others, we know that every location can build a turbine and benefit from the power it's able to generate. Next, harvesting wind power is clean, non-polluting way to generate electricity, and unlike other power plants, wind energy doesn't emit any air pollutants or greenhouse gases. Wind energy is far more eco-friendly and has lower operational costs than the burning of fossil fuels for electricity. So there's no doubt that the fact that wind energy will reduce our reliance on fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. However, although we see this hope for wind energy currently in the US and other countries, we're still dependent on fossil fuels, which can be harmful to human and animal health. So once turbines have been installed, the cost of maintaining turbines and generating the wind power is next to nothing. So the average wind turbine that is installed in the U.S. today has an operational lifespan of 120,000 hours. So this gives a turbine up to 20 years of productive use.
That's amazing, actually. But now I'm sure that there are some cons to go with those pros, are there not?
Yes, definitely. Just like anything, wind energy does have its disadvantages. First, wind power must still compete with conventional generation sources on a cost basis. Depending on how energetic a wind site is, the wind farm might not be the most competitive, even though the cost of wind power has decreased dramatically in the past 10 years. The technology requires a higher initial investment than fossil fuel generators. There are 3 cost points that should be considered when installing a wind turbine. The first is the actual manufacturing and installing costs of the turbine itself. The current manufacturing cost of wind turbines that is large enough to power a home are up to $80,000 for a single unit.
That's pretty expensive.
Yes, it definitely is. And according to the Department of Energy, a utility-scale wind turbine could cost up to $2.2 million per megawatt of capacity.
Wow.
The second point involves land use. Although turbines don't take up much space, the rights to use the land where the wind blows the most consistently may need to be purchased or leased. And the final cost point involves connectivity. Our current power infrastructure is rated to be worth trillions of dollars. Connecting wind energy power to the current network can involve investments that cost billions of dollars if the wind turbines are installed in rural areas. There are also a few minor disadvantages, such as aesthetic impact, noise, and remoteness of location. So many people are concerned with the visual effects that turbines have on the beautiful scenery of nature. In order to harness the full power of the wind, a turbine has to be dozens of meters tall. Wind turbines can affect local property values if the turbines interfere with a natural view of some mountains, lake, or other points of property value. Homes that are also near large wind turbines regularly report high levels of noise from the technology. The spinning blades in the wind creates vortex movements, which enhances the natural sounds of the wind so they are louder. Although remoteness of location can be seen as an advantage, since wind turbines will be placed in desolate areas far away from people, it can also be a disadvantage. The cost of travel and maintenance on the turbines increase and it's time consuming. So in my opinion, the biggest disadvantage is the effect wind turbines have on wildlife. Wind turbines are extremely dangerous to avian species, insects, and their habitat. Although many animals have been killed due to the rotors of the wind turbine, there has been a progressive increase in research done to understand the impacts wind turbines have on wildlife.
That's actually a really interesting point that you bring up, because I've heard about the noise complaints, and I've heard about the fact that wind turbines can't always produce power. But I haven't heard about this damage to animals and wildlife that wind turbines cause. So could we go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. So although wind energy provides environmental benefits of generating electricity without carbon emissions, water use, or emissions of water and air pollutants, the siting and operation of wind energy can present a risk of adverse impacts to wildlife, particularly individual birds and bats. Even though many strides have been taken to protect wildlife and their habitat, many continue to face negative consequences due to wind turbines. So an estimated hundreds of thousands of birds and bats die every year when they accidentally collide with turbine blades. Furthermore, wind energy development can contribute to habitat loss, road and other infrastructure constructions, which can have significant impacts on birds. In order to prevent the mortality rate from increasing, government agencies and wildlife advocates have been coming together to collaborate on solutions for these issues. Wildlife organizations have been collaborating to study and understand how bats interact with wind turbines. Biologists have found that bats are most active when wind speeds are low. Using this information, the Bats and Wind Energy Cooperative concluded that keeping wind turbines motionless during times of low wind speeds could reduce bat deaths by more than half without significantly affecting power production. They also have been exploring the development of ultrasonic deterrents to warn bats away from turbines. However, as of yet, more research needs to be done in order to determine the true effect of wind turbines on wildlife and their habitats. It should also be noted that wind energy does not only affect avian and bat life, but also insects and marine ecosystems. However, in regards to marine life, wind farms may act as marine preservation areas because fishing and bottom trawling is not allowed for safety reasons. So these areas can support greater biodiversity than unproductive areas. Even though there are some upsides to wind farms, one unanticipated consequence of all of this is that these new ecosystems can support alien species which would not otherwise be able to gain a foothold. But since much research still needs to be done, we are not aware of the long-term consequences that wind turbines have against animal life.
Okay, Catherine, so thank you for that great description of both the pros and the cons about wind energy referring to wildlife, but let's try to relate it to botany a little bit more. So how would you say wind energy could either be helpful or hurtful to plants as we know it?
All right, so wind power has some of the lowest environmental impacts of any source of electricity generation, and unlike conventional sources, wind power significantly reduces carbon emissions, saves billions of gallons of water a year, and cuts pollution that creates smog and triggers asthma attacks. Wind farms also leave the overwhelming majority of land they're built on undisturbed. Wind power is a low-carbon energy source, so when a wind turbine generates electricity, it produces zero carbon emissions. The development of clean wind energy avoids significant CO2 pollution. In 2017, the electricity generated from wind turbines avoided an estimate 189 million tons of carbon pollution. This reduction is equal to roughly 11% of 2017 power sector emissions, or 40.3 million cars worth of CO2 emissions. A typical wind project repays its carbon footprint in 6 months or less, providing decades of zero-emission energy. Wind power is on the rise across America, like I stated before. The U.S. generates 24 times more electricity from wind power than we did in 2001, providing clean fossil fuel energy that helps the nation do its part in fighting against global warming. American wind power is already significantly reducing global warming pollution. In 2013 alone, wind power averted 132 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions, as much as would be produced by 34 typical coal-fired power plants. But with the U.S. and the world needing to move toward a future of 100% clean energy in order to prevent the worst impacts of global warming, America must do much more.
Very impressive overall. Those are some great statistics. So why don't we move on to talking about the future of wind energy? Because so far we've been focusing on where wind energy came from and where it is today. So where do you see it going?
So at this moment, the global wind industry is now present in over 80 countries, 26 of which have more than 1 gigawatt installed and 8 with more than 10 gigawatts. The global wind industry has had another record-breaking year in 2015. The annual installations topped 63 gigawatts. Not only did renewables surpass all other power sector investments, for the first time, capital investments in renewables surpassed all capital investments in fossil fuels. By the end of 2015, there were about 433 gigawatts of wind power spinning around the globe, which is a 17% increase from the previous year. The Wind Energy Technologies Office works with industry partners to increase performance and reliability of next-generation wind technology while lowering the cost of wind energy. The office's research efforts have actually helped to increase the average capacity factor from 22% of our wind turbines installed before 1998 to an average of nearly 35% today. So looking ahead, the Global Wind Energy Council sees wind energy installations nearly doubling in the next 5 years. Wind power has become the most cost-effective option when adding new capacity to the grid in an increasing number of markets, and the prices are continuing to fall. Given the urgency to cut down CO2 emissions and continued reliance on imported fossil fuels, wind power's pivotal role in the world's future energy supply is assured.
Well, that is a great message, Catherine, and I thank you so much for giving us that lovely explanation of wind power overall.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for being here,
Thanks so much for having me.
and we will see you guys next time.